you could do worse than follow our lead, and don't give anybody any credit, and don't advertise, don't market your product, let the dealers do it for you. And they were fighting each other for it in the end. So it was a kind of inverse logic. Instead
Yep.
of trying to make yourself well known, I was saying to people when they phoned up, I'm sorry, but your name's not on my list.
And hello, welcome to Not an Audiophile, the podcast. I'm Andrew Hutchison, and this is episode 16, season 1. And today we are interviewing Mike Creek, the man who started Creek Audio. He gives us some considerable insight into how it happened, how it continues to happen. It's a great story of electrical engineering, amplifier design, marketing, industrial design, all sorts of details. Let's go. Hey, thank you, Mike, for coming on the podcast. Not an audiophile, it's greatly appreciated. And I've got some probing questions for you that aren't that probing, but I would love to hear the story of how Creek kind of came off a clean sheet of paper to some degree, from what I understand, and lots of other questions that I've got, just generally, I guess, about your thoughts on amplifiers, maybe the industry a little bit, what have you, and but how did it start? The way it seems from an outsider's point of view, you designed this fairly straightforward, good performing amplifier, and you offered it to the market, and people ordered thousands. Is that what happened?
Basically, yes. I suppose it didn't come from a clean sheet of paper.
Oh, okay,
I sort
right.
of, took some inspiration from a product I'd made for my father with the help of a very special engineer, special in special needs, I think, yes, if you know what I mean.
Well, he's an engineer, right?
Yes. So, yes, I had inspiration from that and other things, which I've been working in a company as a freelance engineer stroke developer and copywriter for about 5 years, I suppose, when one day during a long recession, as we often get here, they said, hey, guess what, you were the first in, you're the last, or the last in, rather,
last in,
and you're the first
off.
out, and you're not contracted here to work, so sorry, we've got to let you go. It didn't help that they owed me sort of 3 months worth of money.
Oh, okay.
So I was working on a shoestring, and my mother, I know, was having sleepless nights about how I was going to feed the family, and dreaming of us as a family standing at the side of the road with a suitcase or something.
Yeah, surely not. Hopefully, quite that bad.
I have more confidence in myself. I have more confidence than she did in myself.
Yes.
Well, essentially what happened is I had been working for a company called Ambit International, which was a sort of electronics company that made products or parts available for radio amateurs, made mainly radio products, and not commercial radio. I mean, sort of mobile radio for people in cars, and they call it PMR radio, and that kind of thing with radio amateurs on shortwave and very high frequency things in VHF and UHF. So
transceivers,
it was very different
so to speak,
from mine. And that sort of thing. Yes, indeed. So I was surrounded by hamsters, as they call them here, radio amateurs, and they were all, a nice bunch of people. And that company grew very, very quickly. But in the end, it grew too fast for its own good, and they had to sort of draw back in a little bit. And in that same year that I left them and started Creek Audio, Alan Sugar, an entrepreneur in the UK who I had some connections with through work, had also employed one of their directors called Roland Perry to design their first PC computer. So Amstrad got into computers in the same year that I started the Creek Audio brand.
Oh yeah, because Alan Sugar was the Amstrad man. Is that?
That's it. Well, it's AMS is Alan. I forget his Morris
something or other.
Sugar Trading.
Acronym. Yeah. I haven't thought about that for a while, but yes, that's. I mean, he's got such a history since then, I guess. But that's. So that's how he got his. Well, was that his first big, without going off you, but was that his first big success business-wise? Was it the Amstrad Computing?
Oh no, he left. Well, there was a history going back to I'll go back to my father's days. My father worked for a businessman in North London called Robert Henson, and Robert Henson had a son called Peter Henson. He had two sons, but Peter was the one I knew best of all.
Yes. Yeah.
And Robert Henson and my father knew each other from sort of post-war period, when he gave my father a job as what they refer to loosely as a van boy. In other words, here's a bunch of electronic components, go out and sell them to retailers.
Oh, okay, retailers
would buy, things from the back of the van, basically. What stock he had available. And Alan Sugar worked for Peter Henson and Robert Henson, but Peter was really his boss.
Okay.
And then one day Peter, I'm keeping this brief because I'm sure you want to concentrate on other things. But Peter
let's join the dots.
Miscounted what he put on the van, and Peter sort of accused Alan Sugar of stealing some stock.
Okay,
Alan went home and had a sort of hissy fit and decided he didn't want to work for a company that didn't trust him anymore.
Okay.
And went out and formed AMS Trading.
All right.
And he went out and bought his own products from all the suppliers that he already knew that Henson had. And the rest is history.
It certainly is. Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, that accusation was a boo-boo then, wasn't it? Because I guess he was somewhat sharper at business than the people who had accused him of...
Yes, indeed. Well, he had a certain extra that they didn't have.
Yep.
And the foresight, unlike Robert Henson, the father, employed my father as a van boy, and my father said, why don't you get into doing this, or why don't you buy these and sell that? He said, well, I won't use the expletives, but he basically said, if you think you can do it any better, go and do it yourself. And he did.
And he did.
Yes.
Oh, dear.
So the history repeated itself.
Indeed. So, okay, so that's so timing similar. You to when you re-Amstrad versus Creek Audio, and you released the CAS, which is, obviously it was probably referred to as the CAS, or was it the CAS 4040?
CAS.
CAS.
People call it CAS. I never even thought of it when I called it CAS, but it was just Creek Audio Systems to me, and that's what we printed on the front panel. With I had a sort of a no-cost involved logo developed for me by one of my colleagues who in the art department of Ambit International, who in his lunch break said, well, let's got three letters, let's make the S the biggest one and put the C and the A in the gap between the top and the bottom. And I didn't really think about it too much when I thought, that's great, that's that job done, now move on to the next one. And then we kept that until about 1985 or 86, when I changed it for a more readable logo.
Hey, Speaking of logos, though, is the current logo not? It's the same that you've had for a very long time, I think, isn't it?
Yes, since about 85.
Yeah, so that is the 85 logo still. Yeah, well, that's borderline a record, I think, in hi-fi industry as far as logos. I mean,
Well, steady on. I mean, it's been a bit tweaked since.
well,
then,
yeah, polished a little, but
yeah.
the gist of it seems to be the
originally
same.
done on a drawing board, you see. So,
Of course,
these
yes.
days done with CAD,
Mm.
so it's sort of sharpened up a bit.
Yeah, but I think it's a similar style. I think it's the same.
Oh, it's
sort of-
exactly the same.
Yeah, yeah,
If
you've
you
just-
look at it quickly, if
Yes.
you want to look at it in, blown up 100 times, you
Well,
see that it's quite different.
Yes, yeah. So you're saying the 4040, the design was a bit of a spin-off of something else. Did it?
Well, it was a spin-off of an amplifier. How should we say it? It's what they would refer to as separates.
Yes.
My father manufactured audio equipment from 1948. So he started as a reel-to-reel tape recorder manufacturer when there was perhaps only Ferrograph or Brunel in the industry at that time.
Okay.
And imports. And he was made the first truly lower cost domestic audio tape recorder, and tape being new in those days from BASF, and previously it had been wire recorders. So he bought a tape deck from a company solely making tape decks, and added his own amplifier, separate oscillators, and it was done. It wasn't integrated into one box.
Sort of a modular.
Had to think of it.
Yeah, okay.
But later on, when tape recorders didn't fall out of fashion, but the government taxed them overnight from 0 to 45% in a budget that killed the business overnight. He switched to making record players.
Okay.
And that's when I joined the business. I mean, I'd been working, in holidays and things like that for the business before, but in '69 when I joined him, we started making record players, and later into music centres, as they referred to then, and there's a music centre kind of resurgence now, but towards the end I was doing R&D and development work and off-site manufacturing, as well as managing the production line and doing all sorts of different jobs. But I just saw a demand for a separate integrated amplifier and separate tuner, AM/FM tuner. And that's what I developed together with another colleague called Jim Samiotis.
Yeah.
Who was the special engineer I was talking about, who was a friend of mine as well as a colleague. But he worked freelance, and I sort of saw the advantages of working freelance, because you could do as much or as little as you wanted for a company and still make a living. So at a certain point in time, when the founder of Ambit International got in touch with me one day, because he was also doing consultancy work for us on radio, and said, come to a Christmas or New Year's party with him. And I turned up and not knowing what to expect, and we sort of talked on the bottom step of his staircase for the whole evening, where everybody else was having a party.
Yeah.
And then the next day, it was confirmed that I was going to go to America with him on a project that he'd been asked to carry out for a Greek guy from America.
Yeah.
And they had these requests for making something that was very unusual and not easy to achieve in those days.
Yeah.
And I went to the American embassy, got a visa, handed my notice in, and basically became freelance from that moment onwards at the age of 23.
Yeah, all right. So that's an early start. Probably, I was going to say a brave move, but I guess at that age it was all very exciting, and there was no thought that it could possibly go wrong.
It was certainly It was certainly exciting, and I wouldn't say it's dangerous, but it was certainly dangerous to my economic health.
Yes,
Nothing else. I had to pay for the ticket, and in those days the ticket was considerably. I wouldn't say it was any different in actual money to the price it would cost you now.
No,
except in those days that would be 10 times more expensive.
Absolutely, yeah, isn't it? It's one of those things that HiFi and airfares have hardly changed in price. I mean, HiFi has gone up a bit, but airfares is the airfares and the price of music, recorded music, never been cheaper. So then the connection there, so that was the relationship, the engineering relationship effectively that helped that. And I should mention that the 4040 was your first product, for those that are wondering why we're talking about that particular amplifier. And how did that you connect the dots to the development? Or, I mean, you made the decision to build a separate tuner, a separate amplifier, integrated amplifier.
Yes.
At what point did that sort of, you go, right, I'm going to do this, I mean, you decided you wanted to do it. I mean, did you look at things like the NAD? I feel like the NAD 3020 was almost happening at the same time. And, of course, a few other UK-built amps were probably a little more expensive than where yours ended up in the market.
The Arcam.
Yeah, Arcam's the one I'm thinking.
The A&R Cambridge, as it was called then.
Called then, yeah.
A60, yeah.
That's the one I had in mind, and I had it partly in mind because it's kind of a luxurious but slimline version of what yours ended up being in a way.
Yes, it had a real wood cover, and it had a...
Yes.
It was physically larger and heavier. I don't know. I hadn't really much of a clue what I was going to do to begin with, but after looking around what was available for me to use, I came to the conclusion that the covers that were produced as what's called a vinyl wrap for my father's amplifier, which had ceased production by that time.
Yeah.
There were about 200 or 300 of them left.
Oh, okay.
And I also had a prototype of a wooden cover made years beforehand, but never used, which was lying around in my workshop. And I always looked at this and thought, one day I'll fit an amplifier in
underneath it. Yes.
But it was too small to fit an amplifier in when I first got it.
Oh, okay.
But by the time I looked at it for the second time, or later, in late 81,
yes,
which was when I became unemployed, my attention was more focused on that. But knowing that would be more expensive to produce, I just looked at these surplus to requirements wooden covers, vinyl wrap ones, which were a box, which were truly top and bottom cover, and you just slid the electronics through the box and bolted it underneath.
Underneath, yep.
I suppose it looked as ugly as a hatful, as they say in Australia. And
what? We wouldn't say that, would we? Yeah, we probably would have actually. So it was a bit
not the Creek,
chunky looking.
It was too chunky.
Yeah.
So at the time I was married, and my father-in-law ran a shop fitting business. He did carpentry and joinery and French polishing is another thing, different business, but another branch of his empire, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I popped down to his workshop and said, "Can I use your bandsaw?" And I sawed one in half and reduced the front to back depth.
Yep.
And looked at it and thought, well, that would work. At the Windsor amplifier that it was modelled after had a extruded front panel, which was not made or wasn't custom made for Windsor. It was just how should we say, a stock extrusion.
Yes.
And again, I thought I'll make it less expensive by using sheet metal. So I produced a sheet metal front panel, bent to fill in the routed or the rebaited front edge, and a smaller chassis, and I put it into a box where the depth of the box appeared to be greater, to be the actual depth of the amplifier, when in fact it was about through 2 to 3 centimeters less deep for the chassis.
Yep.
So the heat sink of the amplifier, which I used, was it was another off-the-shelf heat sink.
Yes.
Stuck out the back and had some better cooling efficiency than it would be if it was trapped inside.
Yes. Yep.
And it also allowed you to put the plugs in the back without them sticking out or being visible, so you could almost put the amplifier against a wall.
Yeah,
it was very,
and the
very
cables
shallow.
Came away from underneath, kind of thing. So,
exactly. Yeah.
So, because it's a while since I've seen one of those 4040s in the flesh, and I've kind of forgotten it wasn't overly deep as I remember. It was incredibly slimline. It was very thin, I guess is the word, is it? I mean, it was certainly short. And I'm thinking it was like, I don't know, is it like 1.25 inches high or something? Or maybe it was 1.5 inches, but it wasn't very high, was it?
It was about 55 millimeters. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so a couple of inches. Yeah, all right. So, well, as we probably should say these days, 55 millimeters. Yep. So, what was the inside, the electronics, the sort of topology of the amplifier? I'm guessing quite simple and straightforward. I mean, people listening probably don't realise that this amp, as I remember it, sold in the UK once you launched it into the market. Was it for £99?
Correct, including tax.
Including tax?
I think it was probably, yes, which was about 10%, I believe, or 12.5%, something like that.
So, I mean, that sounds outrageously inexpensive for what was, a very serious amp as far as its performance. It was very musical, had adequate power. I mean, it was, I guess, it set the scene for your later models, really, as far as the way it sounded, I think. Would you agree with that, or do you feel that it was adequate for the time, or do you think? I mean, what I'm really saying is, do you think one of the reasons it's
adequate?
Well, yeah, that shouldn't be taken perhaps the way it sounded. But what I meant was, were you just happy with the sound, or were you rather ecstatic with the sound that you'd achieved for what was an incredibly inexpensive retail price?
I have to say that it was stooping a little bit low for me to make something like that when I knew I could make something better.
Yeah.
But I always had a thing for this amplifier that we used for the Windsor amplifier. And although I've been making sort of large MOSFET power amps and preamps, which were very, very complicated as kits for hobbyists to make, which were cutting edge technology. This was the very opposite, the antithesis of what I'd been making before.
Yeah.
But it had a certain something, it had a sound that was very soothing and smooth to listen to, considering, as you say, it was a relatively simple amplifier.
Yep.
The power amp had, let me think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 transistors in total, but the power transistors were Darlingtons. So
were they? Okay.
They were 2 transistors
Saved
in one
a couple.
package.
Yep. So 2 Darlingtons a channel and 5 sort of small signal sort of transistors.
No, three
small signal. 3 small signal transistors and 2 Darlington outputs. Oh, that's a simple circuit. Okay, all right. Yeah. So,
that's why I said it was 5 in total.
Wow.
Including the Darlingtons, which were operated in Class B, and that's no bias, no idle current.
Okay.
Initially, I didn't put any devices in there to try and nudge them into class AB.
Yeah.
But later we used 2 or even 3 diodes to try to sort of give them a little bit of current to overcome
a sniff of
crossover
current.
distortion.
So,
But
okay,
the unusual
yeah.
thing about it was that the Class A driver was essentially 2 stages. It was 2 devices, which created an enormous open loop gain.
Mm-hmm.
And this enormous open loop gain would have been unnecessary if it had not been for the fact that, to simplify the amplifier, I used the high open loop gain closed around 2 feedback loops, one DC and the other AC.
Right, yeah.
And the AC feedback loop powered or overcame the insertion loss of the tone controls. So I didn't even use a transistor or an op amp for the tone controls. I used the feedback from the power amp to encapsulate it.
Oh, wow. Now I'm even more impressed. I mean, this is actually, that's one of the simplest amplifier designs that includes tone controls probably ever made in production, I would have thought, would it? I mean, because,
yes, but it hadn't been, it came after the Windsor and other products similar to that, which were lost since they were used as record player amplifiers.
Yeah.
And it was only when I used that circuit in the integrated amplifier, which was 10, 12 at the most watts into 8 ohms, that you could see or hear its benefits, because otherwise you're using a record player amplifier. The source was an auto change turntable and
ceramic
magnetic cartridge.
Oh, magnetic cartridge. Okay. Oh, ceramic cartridge. Yeah.
No, sometimes magnetic, but more often than not a ceramic cartridge.
Yeah. So let's just wind back a little bit to the Class B, because people's ears pricked up briefly. Because you got away with that. Why is that? Because of the characteristics of the Darlington, or was it something you did? I mean, you mentioned that ultimately you changed the design a little to give them a little bit of idle current, or what have you.
Yes.
But the initial version, how did it sound with that somewhat rudimentary design? And it was in fact this magic sound that you're referring to, this very musical sound, smooth sound, I think you said, was actually because of the simplicity of the circuit, do you think?
There was a bit of both there, but this particular circuit had a characteristic sound that you couldn't design. It was a bit of serendipity.
Okay.
And the serendipity that I'd experienced when taking the Windsor amplifier to my bedroom, which doubled as my hi-fi room, where I was playing sound through a pair of floor-standing four driver loudspeakers with the bass mid and treble being from KEF,
yes.
B139, B110, and T27.
T27, yep.
And Cole's Super Tweeter, and the bass was transmission line loaded.
Right.
And I used to play these fairly loud in my room with a Radford transistor Radford preamp and power amp, and I always thought there was something not to my taste until I brought the Windsor amplifier in and listened to that, and I thought, well, okay, so it's only 10 watts opposed to 50 watts. But apart from that, in a small room, it was a lot more pleasant to listen to over a period of time.
Okay.
And that's what spawned the idea of using that circuit, but supercharging it with a few more volts and bigger capacitors, and I humbucked it a little bit to get rid of, because I should have mentioned that the reason it had so few transistors is it used resistive current sources, not a transistor or diodes or anything as a reference. So that tends to lead to a bit of power supply ripple being ending up in the signal path if you don't filter it properly. So I would do that, but it was still very simple. But the sound quality of it. A colleague of mine or friend of mine, should I say, who I often used to ask questions of, was a field sales engineer at Philips Semiconductors.
Yeah, okay.
He wasn't the transistor salesman, he was the integrated circuit salesman, but he was classically trained, and he proffered a sort of a kind of a technical explanation to why it worked. And he said that you have so much open loop gain in this circuit that if it's not going unstable, it's used to, in a certain way, create what would otherwise be known as dither in a digital circuit.
Yeah, okay.
So there's a sort of a noise, or which you can't hear, but it's going on there, that is used to fill in the transition between the positive and negative half cycles of the signal.
Okay.
So if you were to look at it at high frequencies, yes, you could see crossover distortion, but it appeared not to be there, just in the same way that a 16-bit digital signal without dither wouldn't sound as good as it would together with dither.
And
that was really the I would say the technical explanation, if anyone should have asked me at that stage, which I don't think they did. But looking back on it now, it kind of worked because of like an error that was a positive instead of an error which was only a negative.
Well, so it is a very happy arrangement, like one that's meant to be in a way, because, as you say, it had a certain sound and it worked, and maybe it kind of shouldn't.
Yeah.
But I've forgotten what I was going to say. Something about the.
Well, I'd fill in while you're thinking about that.
Yeah.
I'd say, thinking about it now, if I'm going back to my radio days, in the shortwave radios worked on different principles, either by heterodynes or super heterodynes, or before that super regenerative. It was almost like a super regenerative amplifier.
Okay.
You tune it to the point of oscillation, and when you got to there, you got the peak gain and the peak sensitivity and so on. So
okay.
It kind of worked like that.
We'll take a quick break. Back, folks, in a second. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the podcast. It's really appreciated. And even more appreciated is comments, likes, 5-star reviews, that kind of thing. It's also very much appreciated. So if you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe, follow, like, and comment. And thank you to the listener in Canada for commenting on the sound quality. We are working on it. We're back with Mike Creek, and we've made the discovery that his first amplifier was in fact not just great sounding, but was Class B, which, he doesn't mention too much in the brochure, I guess. Or did you? You didn't.
I didn't deny it. I didn't make it a selling feature either, because that's the kind of amplifier that musicians would expect to find in a guitar amp or a PA amp of today.
Yes.
And it was done purely to save on the heatsink. Heatsink was one of the costliest items inside an amplifier, except for those companies I shall not mention by name, who didn't use heatsinks. They just used the case.
Yes, by name. You're not going to mention them by name. Okay. All right.
No,
good.
No.
I was going to say idle current. Well, there isn't any. So basically, when you turned the volume down, the amp was stone cold, more or less.
Indeed, it was completely. There was no idle current, and therefore no, apart from a small current draw from current sources in the power amp circuit, and we're talking about 5 or 6 milliamps in total. That's and the same with the preamp.
Yeah,
there wasn't much of a preamp. The very first ones just had an emitter follower, so it was a unity gain
buffering circuit kind of thing, really. Yeah,
and the gain required for the tone control or insertion loss to overcome the insertion loss just use the feedback from the power amp.
Yes.
And for the phono pre-amplifier, we used a Philips op amp, which was designed primarily to be used on a single rail power supply, which is the other thing I should mention. This was a AC coupled single rail power supply. So what it saved in some areas, like having two power supply caps, it had one larger one, and it had to pay for, if you wanted low frequencies, you had to use a fairly substantial output coupling capacitor, something like 2,200. And strictly speaking, it should have been full rail in case anything went wrong, but we used to play it sort of, let's say not quite so safe, and put something like 50 volts in instead of 63
63
volts.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Keep your fingers crossed.
This is for the coupling cap we're talking about, the output coupling cap,
yes.
So if nothing goes that, but if something does, you're going to exceed that. So you're saying the
well, if the center, voltage or the midpoint voltage drifted above what it should have been, half of the high
swing
voltage supply,
yeah,
then you could over voltage that cap.
Yeah, okay.
It was very rare that it did that, and it usually would do that as a result of one or both power transistors breaking. Generally, if both power transistors broke, it would take the fuse out, and so it would save everything that would otherwise over voltage. And so instantly.
Was your design sort of goal to make? So was the output stage symmetrical then? Was it? So the devices were the same?
Yes. Well, it was symmetrical insofar as there was a PNP and an MPN.
But you still just had the one rail voltage, and you coupled the output, which I guess which was really kind of in the 70s, was particularly with your father's business with the radiograms, as we would have called them here. That was pretty typical in an output stage. I guess it's for whatever reason. I was just maybe how it was done at the time.
Funny you should mention that. Initially, we used transistors. But not making the circuits ourselves. We bought a module from, they were called Mullard modules.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was an LP016 if memory serves me.
Okay.
It's strange if I can remember that.
It's bizarre,
accurately.
yes.
I can remember that. I can remember the telephone number of Mullard, as they were allowed to call themselves, even though Philips bought Mullard decades beforehand, but they still carried on calling things Mullard, including the valves or tubes.
Indeed.
And that was, how should we say, one of the earlier record player amplifier circuits we'd use. They were mono. They came with essentially an aluminium bracket, which was the heatsink. And you bolted them onto a chassis and hardwired to terminals on there. Later, as we developed our own, we did experiment with. My father was always he was rather interested in using the latest technology, and we were an early adopter of power amp ICs.
Okay.
First one from a company called SGS, which morphed into ST.
Yep.
And the other one from Texas Instruments, who haven't changed their name. But both the ST or SGS and the Texas ones were very good at performing pyrotechnics. Made good indoor fireworks even if you just breathed on them or did something to them. They were very unreliable.
We're talking STK ICs, the earlier ones.
SGS.
Oh, the SGS ones.
SGS.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well,
and they also had a.
So the SGSs were the forerunner to STKs. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, ST, as in the brand ST now.
Yep. Yes.
Which I think, has taken over or did take over that, or that it morphed into that back in the day. I'm not sure of the history of that, so I'm not going to say too much about it, but I would say that they were all that when the sales reps came round and you complained about unreliability, they would always say it was your fault. It was the way you used it. Or
Of course
if you sent them back some broken ones, they said, we can't take these back for credit because you've soldered them. So, well, how would we know whether they worked or not?
Yes. Well, the semiconductor business hasn't changed yet.
One of my many jobs was to drop these ICs into a ZIF socket, or zero insertion force socket, pull the lever down and test them. And out of 5,000, you might get 1,000 that worked. Or,
Oh, wow.
And
Is that right?
I remember taking them back to Texas Instruments in a van, huge box of these things, and giving them to them. And they just looked as if they wanted to cry. And I said, we can't use these anymore if you don't sort out this problem.
That's a horrible failure rate. Gee whiz. So you'd be one of filtering that before you started assembling the amplifiers and soldering them in, right? So
yes, well, yet they were time-consuming to remove and to replace, and you didn't guarantee that the next one you put in would work either if you didn't pre-test it. But then you kind of think that a company like Texas or even SGS at the time would have done their homework, but they were really running. They were pushing the envelope regarding technology. And obviously in later days these things have become rock solid. But what I'm talking about is the early 70s, when it was kind of cutting edge technology.
Indeed.
And we just went back to using transistors, and the transistor circuit that I commissioned Jim Semiotis to make was this Class B circuit, which was very economic in its use of transistors. Having said that, a small signal transistor costs 3 pence. It was more expensive, not even accounting for inflation, then to buy a transistor than it is now. But I still think we could have gone a different route. But in its own way, it helped spawn the first Creek amplifier.
Indeed. And do you think, the thought I think that I had in the previous segment that I had forgotten was that when you mentioned that it was a capacitively coupled output stage, that single rail, that I always feel like there's a certain charm to that. Versus
Indeed, but it's not linear. It's not linear in the sense that the capacitor doesn't have a strong influence on the way it sounds.
No. I guess that's
hence why I used AC feedback, which wasn't used on the Windsor. I put feedback not only after the capacitor but also after the fuse. So I incorporated the nastiness of a bad connection or a fuse, or the negative sound quality effects of a non-linear resistor, if you like, in the circuit by putting global feedback around it.
Okay. So I mean, it's a bit of a classic exercise in thinking, and
it's called value engineering.
Yeah, that's right. It's much harder than trying to build something for $50,000, isn't it? Because it's
well, exactly.
You make everything.
Not a lot of people realise that, but it is, as you quite rightly say, quite a lot harder to budget or build something to a budget than it is to have no budget and just make the best that you can produce, using anything that you can buy in low quantities at very high prices. Because part of my job remit was to buy product parts and component parts at the best price, to where the profit margin was, let's say, at best marginal, and worst, you're making a loss. If you didn't buy well, you didn't make any money at all out of it. So really, that was my experience. of making consumer electronics before I started Creek.
Yes. And so I was going to say, I mean, there's an elegance to making everything in that circuit work optimally in a way so that it sort of aids every other part of the circuit. You don't have to sort of add some circuit off over the side here to sort of fix this issue or whatever. You really have to make everything just sort of balance very sweetly, and it's something I appreciate in here. I'm not sure that everyone that's listening kind of gets just how, I don't know, elegant is the word, really. I think, would you agree that just to get everything a very simple circuit to work well and make a musical sound is a nice thing?
Well, I mean, that is exactly what made it elegant, is the fact that there wasn't even a trim pot in it for adjusting midpoint or whatever. I'd set or trim the amplifier with 2 fixed resistors.
Yeah.
And if it was out, if the offset was too high, I'd adjust it so that you'd either add a resistor across one or another resistor to trim it, a higher value soldered on. So if you ever saw the back of one, there would be occasionally a resistor soldered across the back to fine-tune it, rather than paying for a trim pot, which, as we know, don't always work after 10 years.
Well, no, they are unreliable little things, and of course they do cost an extra couple of pence as well. So now the whole thing with the trimming then and tacking an extra resistor on is... So who was building these things? Maybe we should cover more of the story where you kind of entered the market with this wonderfully simple amplifier, and from what I know, it was taken up by dealers, I presume, at least at the UK level, where you were no doubt driving around and showing it to people. It was taken up very readily, and you quickly found yourself in a situation where you needed to make more. Is that what happened?
Well, actually, the way it rolled out initially was that I'd taken a risk and borrowed £4,000 from my local bank. After the bank manager actually came down, sat in my living room, and had a cup of tea and a biscuit, and we discussed what I was doing. And he lent me £4,000 on the strength of my conversation with him, with no personal guarantee.
Wow, okay.
And I bought some components impressive. To make the first 100 pieces.
Yeah, okay. Just the 100?
And if I hadn't... Yeah, just 100. And needless to say, it's more expensive when you do just 100 than 1,000 or 10,000. Well, which I've been used to with my father's company. So
I feel
that's what I was kind of aiming at.
Being conservative in a way, but it's still quite I'm saying just 100 being slightly sarcastic, because really with a new design and a brand new business, that's a reasonable commitment. You have no idea at this stage, because you've not shown anyone anything at this point, have you, when you borrowed the £4,000, or did you have an inkling that it was going to work?
Well, having made things before which were a lot more expensive for Ambit, and made things which were a lot cheaper from my father's company days. We would make products in the hundreds per week, and not really sure where they were going to, because my job was manufacturing, not so much selling them, although I did know all of the customers my father had, which were mail order companies mainly, and including the Navy Army Air Force Institute, NAFI, which was a big customer, bought products we made and sent them to Germany to the army bases out there for the staff out there to buy through a catalogue. So rarely did we actually sell to retailers. In fact, we sold through wholesale. Okay. And wholesalers took a chunk of your profit margin. So we were always pushed for profit margin, and it was marginal most of the time. Yeah. But the attraction for me was not to go that route, but to go direct to retailers. And so I looked in a few magazines, HiFi magazines at the time, and I looked at the how should we say the better respected brands, which included the likes of Lin, Name, Riga, Exposure, that type of thing. And I saw that essentially they all supplied a limited number of dealers throughout the UK. Now, at this point in time, I was as green as could be, but I did have a few experiences of taking products to shows and demonstrating them with Ambit International, and also as a kid going with my father to consumer electronics shows where he would be demonstrating his products. So showing products at shows was second nature to me, even though I didn't have a budget, much of a budget for doing it. So I took the first sample amp to a London show in Swiss Cottage, which is no longer going, but it was managed by a chain of stores. Well, there was two stores actually, but they sponsored it, they ran it, and it was something I had done once before with Ambit, and so I was familiar with the venue and familiar with what needed to be done, and I took the amplifier, the integrated amp, and I also took a power amp.
Okay.
And the power amp was a MOSFET power amp which could produce 100 watts. And I'd simply made that as a backup in case the integrated amp sales were a bit less than I'd hoped for.
Yes, yeah.
In fact, I met a few contacts there who were interested to both sample the amplifier after the show, and also I met my first salesman, whose name is David Palmer.
Okay.
And he'd been working as a freelance salesman, selling Rogers and one or two other brands. But he and I just hit it off straight away. He lived in Sheffield, or just north of Sheffield, actually. And I was living in London, North London at the time, and so we weren't exactly
not convenient.
Close to each other.
No.
But he came to my house after the show, so he drove down from Sheffield to London and spent a day with me, and we went through it, and he went off with his sample, and a week later I was about to go out shopping with my wife, and the post arrived on a Saturday, as you got post on a Saturday.
Yes. Seems odd, but yes.
And, yes, but there was a sort of a relatively fat envelope from Sheffield in it.
Yeah.
When I opened it, sitting in the car, ready to drive off, and thumbed through about 10 purchase orders on, his good old-fashioned salesman's sales purchase order pad.
Yes, yeah.
I had orders for about 50 amplifiers in there.
Oh, wow. Okay.
One of them was from a company called Doug Brady. Doug Brady, it's the W.A. Brady. And Brady started in Liverpool a long time before I was born, and it was a husband and wife team, and then the son Douglas Brady, who later branched off when he found it impossible to work with the family business anymore. But he carried the theme on himself elsewhere. But he ordered 10 from the strength of one demonstration of the amplifier.
Wow!
Knowing it was a brand that had no history at all and no factory either.
So well, this is the interesting thing.
I was forced to have to make a decision.
Well, I mean, that's both the most, obviously probably one of your happiest memories, that having this bundle of orders sitting there, but at the same time, what am I to do? How do I? I mean, it's always it's your worst but best hope, in the sense that you'd love to sell a lot of amplifiers, but how the hell am I going to build them all? So what did you do? And I guess you did it pretty quickly, because what was the expectation, do you think, of these dealers as far as a timeline to deliver the amplifiers?
Well, they were used to the fact that if something was worth having, they had to wait for it.
Okay, lucky.
And, in those days, Riga would be on a 3 or 4 month waiting list. If you ordered a turntable, you'd be lucky if you got a turntable from Riga in less than 6 months, maybe even a year.
Oh, really? Okay.
It was kind of the equivalent of Morgan cars, where they only built 25 a year or something, or 5 a month. Or
Get on the
whatever
list.
it was that they were building. Yeah.
Okay.
But that was the scene then. Knowing, fortunately, how to manufacture in quantity, I took the decision early on, before I even started Creek Audio, that I never wanted to have anything to do with manufacturing again. If it was the last job in the world, I didn't want to employ staff in a factory. And be chasing members of staff to come into work or stay for the whole week or not go off sick with a sniffly nose or some other excuse. And all the other, human resources type problems, which I'd experienced from 5 years with my father's company.
Yeah, okay.
And didn't want to repeat.
No.
So I had, before starting Creek Audio, to make the electronics myself, been freelancing for other companies. And one company that came up for me, other than Ambit International, which was a company that was a competitor of my father's in the 50s, 60s and early 70s, called Van der Molen. Mm-hmm. Van der Molen was a company formed by Michael Van der Molen and his wife. And they were actually, it was about 2/3 of the way from where I lived to where I worked in Brentwood in Essex. Mm. And the things, I popped in there and just said, "Here's a job," and he said, we need somebody to develop this or that or the other. And I said, well, that's okay, I can do that. He said, how much do you want? And I said, well, I think I wanted £120 a week,
right?
For a 40-hour week. And he said, I'm not paying you that. That's twice what I pay myself. And I said, well, sorry, that's what I charge. Well, it's not a charity. So we didn't work together.
Oh.
I similarly, I did the same with Amstrad, and he wouldn't pay me what I wanted either. So, I would have been one of his earliest apprentices or apprentices or whatever. He would have been a nightmare to work for, whereas Michael Van der Molen was a sweetheart. He was just a really nice person, and his wife also. And he would manufacture for us for about 3 years on a subcontract basis, and he took our production up from 100 in first order up to in 18 months we were manufacturing about 1,350 a month.
Wow.
And 500 tuners a month as well, plus another model also called the 4140, which was the sort of more high-end version.
Okay.
So we were cooking on gas at that time.
Wow. I mean, that's completely impressive, isn't it? I mean, it's stunning. So I don't think this happens anymore, and I'm not sure why or whether. I mean, it's just a different time. I guess I don't know how that even works. You just couldn't imagine starting a new audio business, and even if it was an amazing product, would it get going that fast? It just feels like, I mean, what did you have for marketing? Did you have a sort of a piece of paper with a sketch on it or something and a logo? I mean, there's so many things these days to piece get a product going. I mean, as you well know, I mean, you still are in the business. I mean, there's manuals, packaging. There's, of course, now there's lots of certifications and stuff, and it's a much more complicated circuit. But I don't know. You made it, I guess, youthful enthusiasm, and you kind of had it running, obviously, very quickly. Because what age were you, Mike, when you made this magic happen? Do you remember, roughly?
30.
Wow, okay, yeah.
Yeah, 30 years old.
You knew it all.
Well, I was 29 when I started it.
Yeah, okay.
30 in the first year. I think I had a few positives on my side. First, I had the salesman, David Palmer.
Yes, okay.
Who was covering 2/3 of the country. I did the southeast, which he was somewhat disappointed he didn't get that as well, and made the numbers difficult for him.
Yes,
because he did all the travelling and I did all of the easy bit. I could get to a dealer in 30 minutes.
Yes.
In some cases in London even quicker, and he couldn't even reach one dealer in that time.
Yes.
However, he built it up. He stopped selling anything else. He just concentrated on that.
Okay.
And his advice was, don't do anything different.
Yeah.
Plus the fact I had advice from Roy Gandy.
Okay.
And Terry Davis, who's Roy Gandy's manager, finance director.
Yeah.
At Riga Research, and they said, you could do worse than follow our lead, and don't give anybody any credit, don't advertise, don't market your product, let the dealers do it for you. And they were fighting each other for it in the end. So it was a kind of inverse logic, instead of trying to make yourself well known. I was saying to people when they phoned up, I'm sorry, but your name's not on my list. And they said, nobody's ever told us that before. So, well, and when it does come on my list, I'll get back in touch with you. But, I was very fortunate that I allocated a maximum number to the dealers who I felt would do the best for me.
Yes.
And I didn't... I had a big map on the wall of the country and where the drawing pin or marker pin where I wanted or needed a dealer to get geographical coverage. And I tried to avoid having more than one dealer in one city or town. Yeah. With a couple of exceptions. I mean, London was a big exception because it was necessary to have them here and there. But in the end... we did as much business as we could when giving no credit to any of them. Now, we didn't ask pro forma payment. We didn't ask for money up front.
No.
But in those days, you took a check with a delivery.
Yes. Yep.
So,
COD.
I didn't even give them. I didn't even give them, extra discount for early payment either. So cash settlement discounts, none. I just said, if you want them, you have to pay for them. This is the price.
I guess that's all changed now. But just so at some point you bought a world map and stuck that on the wall and started putting pins in it. Is that
not very long after that first, exhibition? Yeah. Yes, I had let's say a smaller map of the world because I didn't want to expand beyond the UK earlier than I should have done. And in a certain way, looking back on it now, it was both positive and a negative thing to have an overseas market. Yeah. And it didn't stop the phone ringing from countries all around the world asking for this product, which was being reviewed well in magazines, and they just saw these magazines and thought, oh, they don't have a distributor in this country, let's be their distributor. And my first distributor in Australia came to, two of them came to visit. Yeah. And I made the choice to go with Derek and Jackie Pugh, who were running a company called Concept Audio out of Sydney. Yeah. And later on, they sort of became one of my better customers. But I knew them as well from my experience of Mordant Short was a company I used for, let's say, if I was recommending loudspeakers to anyone, then let's say the Mordant Short MS-20 was the speaker that I would have recommended to go with it. amongst others. But,
Yeah.
and they were the importers for Morden Shaw.
Indeed, they were, and the store that I was involved with sold both products, which is how I, know something about the 4040, because it was on the MS20s were there and the 4040 was on the shelf, and I didn't know at that point Derek or Jackie, because they probably wouldn't have visited the far corners of the country. Maybe they did get around, I don't know. Well, Jackie perhaps, I don't know. Did Derek go on the road? We don't know. But the point is...
Derek, according to his autobiography, he did, yes.
Oh, he did? Okay.
But, yes.
Because he's got tales to tell of the road.
Yes. But I think later on he sort of backed off from doing that, and I think Jackie did go out on the road a fair bit, usually to naughty dealers who didn't pay on time.
Yep. Yeah.
You go with a sharp stick.
Stick, and give them a poke.
Yes.
So really, the sweet time then, almost linear or maybe exponential growth from 82, I believe, through till, was there 3 or 4 years of... it must have been crazy times, but it's at the same time crazy. But you had yourself organised, because you had all of the manufacturing contracted out. I still imagine you were the phone was just going bang, because that's how business was done to some degree. Although you were getting letters, I guess, getting mail, but early faxes. Are we talking the days of the fax at this point? Almost, not quite, but
telex.
Telex, yes, yeah. What was fax,
telex,
like 87?
But we didn't have a telex.
No,
we didn't have a telex machine. Although I was used to one.
Yep.
Working for Ambit, they had everything.
Yes,
they were very, very modern and cutting edge. But faxes started at about 86, 87.
Yep.
But I didn't get one until I sold the business in 88, which was kind of necessary then, even if it wasn't sort of long-lasting as my own. It was a thermal fax, so if you didn't read it fast enough, the letters would disappear.
Don't leave it in the sun.
Yes.
I have an order here for 500 units, but it's faded and disappeared.
Yes. Exactly.
So
to answer your question, you said about the exponential growth. It certainly, exponential growth is great if you've got a fundamental, well-funded capital base, and I didn't. I was borrowing money to make money, and borrowing money at a higher rate of interest at times.
Well, that was the high interest era as well, wasn't it?
The interest rate went up from sort of an average to something that was phenomenal. I think it was about 18% in the UK at one point.
Yes.
In that period of time.
Yep.
And whilst trying to pay my mortgage and run the business and employ staff and chase overseas debts where the distributors didn't pay in advance, not always anyway. I began to give credit, and that's where it started to go a little bit crazy. And I had to say that it was, to use a sort of an economics term, over trading in the extreme.
Yep.
To have 600% growth per annum would be dangerous for any business.
Yeah.
And one day that came very close to wiping us out, because our factory, which was not far from where we were, but it was, sort of like half an hour drive, Michael van der Molen came to me rather sheepishly one morning and said, "Here's your delivery. I've got some good news and some bad news." And I said, "What's the good news?" He said, "The factory's okay." So what's the bad news? He said, "I've calculated that we didn't have enough fire insurance to cover the materials that we've ordered on your behalf." Now, when I say they're subcontractors, we paid for all the materials. We just paid for them to produce the product.
Yeah.
And they only produced it up to a certain point. They never completed it. We by that time had taken on space for a factory to do the final assembly, testing, packing, and dispatch. And I was doing that in my house quite happily until I got to 100 a week. And when you've got 100 amplifier boxes in your house, stacked on the staircase like Lego bricks, and I had 2 garages at the bottom of the garden with one a retired man down there drilling holes in heat sinks and tapping them and that kind of thing. And you think, this has got to move to a more professional basis.
Yeah.
And that's when the expenses went up, of course.
Yes.
And coupled with that and the fact that the factory nearly burned down because the factory next door caught light and they only just stopped the flames from licking over and joining up with the next one where our place was.
Oh, dear.
But we literally had 3 months production in finished stock, sub-assemblies and partially assembled products, and raw materials for the next month following that.
Yes.
I mean, Van der Molen operated in a big factory that was once their own, but they just operated for me in a small corner of it as a subcontractor, and the rest of the factory was sublet to other companies. And it was the factory of fire. Factory next to them. But they were just fortunate, and it was that at that point also he went to his accountant, who coincidentally happened to be my accountant. Yes. and my father's accountant before me.
Okay.
And the accountant advised me to put my prices up, which I did.
Yeah.
And then the next week, Michael van der Molen went and he told him to put his prices up, which wasn't very helpful.
No.
If he'd done it the other way round, I could have avoided having to put my prices up twice.
It's up again, yes.
But I took a sort of wrong move there and decided that he was, having a laugh. And I just said to him, I'll find somebody else to make it. And he took it reasonably well. But he didn't like the fact that he was almost 100% manufacturing for me, and if I'd taken the work away from him, he'd have no business at all. So I was being a bit hard-nosed in taking it away from him, but I just felt that if I didn't find a cheaper way to produce things, or put my prices up for twice in 1 month, which would seem like a chaos.
That's a problem.
I would be stuck. The problem was that the person I took it to, who claimed to be capable of producing the numbers, wasn't capable of producing even 10% of what we required.
Oh, no.
So the delay in production and sales and the cash flow crisis that caused really put me in a bind. And at the same time, I had, problems at home, which I'll just say were caused by health problems my wife had, and that made me concentrate my mind on what I was doing and looking after her and looking after my son and looking after the business was taking a toll on me as well.
No doubt.
Coincidentally, we had a visit from our Dutch distributor one morning, who used to turn up at a drop of a hat and say, "Good morning, I've brought the coffee." So I didn't know you were coming. And he said, "Yes, I want to go and visit Mordaunt Short. I'd like to buy their loudspeakers." And I'm just saying, "All right, I'll ring Christopher Short." So I did, and introduced him to this guy who had an entourage with him. They went down there and met him, and Chris Short rang me later and thanked me for the introduction. I don't think he wanted to work with them, but he said in passing, "And when are you going to join our happy band of companies down here?" And I just said, "Pardon?" He said, "Oh, we bought Epos loudspeakers, and company's doing really well. And my company, Mordaunt Short, was sold to TGI PLC, the
Yes.
company that contained Tannoy, Goodman's, and some other companies as well.
Mm-hmm.
But Tannoy, Goodman's, Mordant Short, Apos, Martin Audio, which was a pro audio company.
Yeah.
They had a stock market valuation which was very high, and I think their shares were worth 123 pence at the time, which was quite high.
Mm-hmm.
And they acquired Creek from me because I felt it was an opportunity I couldn't miss.
Well, under the circumstances, it was it would have been a relief, wouldn't it, Mike?
Well, yes. I mean, with my wife with a life-threatening illness and my son having to be taken to school each day and all sorts of other problems as well.
Yes.
I thought, take it.
Take it, yeah.
Just give me a job.
Yes.
So they gave me a 3-year service contract and a percentage of the net profits.
Mm-hmm.
My mistake was not to request a percentage of the gross profit. Smaller percentage of the gross profit.
You still never be any net profit.
No, the net profit could be whatever their accountants decided to make it, and I was therefore in a position where I made the Creek Audio made more money pro rata in its first year than any of the companies in the group did.
Okay.
And because they had a successful business and it was rated at let's say a PE or profit earnings ratio of 10,
mm-hmm.
that $1 profit earned by Creek meant $10 to their share price, $10 to their net earnings. I mean,
mm-hmm.
So Creek did well for them. The second year, not so well. And
mm-hmm.
the third year made no profit at all. Surprise, surprise. Even though they'd increased the turnover.
And is that, well, the net profit? No, because they managed to account themselves out of that to your detriment.
Yeah, they'd accounted for all of the high-earning directors of the company suddenly became consultants to Creek Audio.
Yeah, yes. Well, I think that's another chapter closed. I'm going to have another quick break and we'll come back mm-hmm. and we'll, I guess, for this episode, we'll wrap up the 4040 story. We've not made it a long way through, but it's certainly an exciting part of the Creek story. So back shortly, folks. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the podcast. It's really appreciated. And even more appreciated is comments, likes, 5-star reviews, that kind of thing. It's also very much appreciated. So if you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe, follow, like, and comment. And thank you to the listener in Canada for commenting on the sound quality. We are working on it.
Well, I didn't not advertise, but what I did is I didn't make a, sort of expensive full-page colour advert like Mission used to do, or back cover or front cover.
Yes, yeah.
Inside front cover. The advertising was simply a list of dealers where they could be listened to. Because in those days, people used to go and listen to things before they bought them.
Yeah. And obviously the amp demonstrated well, and people, and it was not like it was, an enormous buying decision. Well, it might have been in Australia by the time Derek got his hot little hands on it, because I have it, and I don't know if you remember the retail price in Australia, but it was not it wasn't $200. I think it was probably, I can't remember, but I'm going to say as much as $600. I think it was there was some handling fees to get it here, which is, to some degree is understandable. But it was also the way it was at the time. There was not a lot of global price parity like there is now, and some listeners would say, well, there's still a problem with that. Some brands still play that game, but because of the internet, it's very transparent. Your current models, because if we skip ahead. No, should we skip ahead? People may not realise you sold the company, but magically you own it today. So obviously there's a part of the story in the middle that we've conveniently left out. But your current 4040, the new 4040, does it sell largely for the same price all around the world? Is it if you take into account exchange rates and what have you, taxes? I would say it
Well,
does.
to answer that, I should just go back and mention the fact that in Australia and especially New Zealand at the time, there were import tariffs.
Yes, there was.
And in New Zealand, we wouldn't sell complete products to them during that period of time. We would only sell semi-knockdown. So
Yep.
they would buy a printed circuit board, tested, and control knobs, maybe a front panel which was printed or not. I can't remember exactly now.
Yeah.
And they'd locally source metalwork and a transformer
Oh, is
and
that right?
cables,
Okay.
connectors. And they assembled it and built it and sold it as like a New Zealand brand or a New Zealand version of that brand.
Ah, okay. We did a bit of that, I think, in Australia, probably in the 70s more, but I can't remember what the import duty was, but it was when you were doing all of this. It was the time when it was coming down. Yep.
I'll ask Jackie the next time I see her, or speak to her rather, because she'll remember those things. She's good like that.
I can't. It's sort of. Everyone was at it. I bought HiFi out of the UK as a teenager because it was half the price, and if you were. Well, I wasn't there, but I had a neighbour who was travelling backwards and forwards, and it was just so much cheaper. It was kind of ridiculous, and I felt a bit guilty doing it. And I still bought stuff locally as well, but there was a couple of pieces that were just so much cheaper. I guess you were putting it in the suitcase and avoiding some duty, as you say. There was also 30% sales tax as well. So as sales tax goes, it was a big number, but it was on the wholesale price because it was a wholesale sales tax, but it's still a lot of money, equivalent basically to your 20% VAT, I guess, that you've got now. I do have other questions, but I think what we'll do is we're going to wrap up episode 1 because I think we've covered so much. But the way I would like to wrap it up is that you tell us briefly how your time went at TGI, and then obviously at some point you weren't working there anymore. I think there's a story to that, perhaps. You went to work one day and maybe it was time to go from there as well. I think you mentioned it to me once, but I can't remember quite what happened.
Yes, I was employed by them on a 3-year contract, as I mentioned before, and it was initially working for my immediate boss was Christopher Short, and unlike Robin Marshall of Epos, who had a seat on the board of directors as part of his deal when selling Epos, I didn't have such a deal. I'm not sure that I would have wanted it, but I did have to write monthly reports as a contribution to the monthly board meetings. And it wasn't the easiest of rides working there because of the politics that used to go on there. But moreover, I think it was the politics which were associated with Chris Short and the way he liked to run his company, and the micromanaged the accounts side of things, where I had been of the opinion that budget to develop new products would be relaxed when I sold the product to him, the company to Mordaunt Short, should I say. But in fact, it wasn't any better, and in fact, it was in some respects more tightly controlled than when I was running it myself. If I wanted a new meter or I wanted a new distortion test set or whatever was necessary in those days for checking the quality of what we were making, he would say, it's not in this year's budget, I'll put it in next year. And you'd say, well, it's hardly significant, but it does mean that we can make something or check something or test something in a way that would guarantee that what we say it is capable of, it is in fact capable of it. You don't want a journalist with a test set like that to tell you otherwise.
Indeed.
And that was a risk when you had products reviewed by the likes of Paul Miller in those days, who would be one of the early adopters of high precision test equipment, and would sometimes, how should we say, pull companies' products to pieces.
Yes.
Regardless of any sort of backlash they would show in terms of removing advertising or other financial rewards for getting a good review.
I mean, that's
so that was a kind of a held back development of new products.
It would have. And just on that subject, I mean, I do remember, and you're going to straighten me out on this, but I feel like, that there was quite a few magazines, UK hi-fi magazines, that were pretty honest in their reviews. I mean, they did write, not so much bad reviews, but they would point out the limitations of a product. They weren't skating around the issues. They'd mention it. Is that your memory? I mean, that's what you just said in this particular case.
Yes.
Is that, I mean, yes. It was that's the way I remember it. It was not all
there
magazines.
There were subjective reviews and there were technical reviews. And
indeed. Yeah.
If you wanted a technical review, you either made sure that the sample they got was working correctly, or you got a bad review.
Indeed.
And in reality, maybe naivety, I always just supplied something from the production line. I never...
You didn't make a special one.
It or in any way, which I'm not saying other companies did, but it's possible.
Well, it is possible. Yes. Not just possible. I'm pretty sure that might have happened. But it's okay. An interesting time. I mean, there was a certain honesty about it, and I wonder whether that was part of their business model, is that people would want to read their reviews because they were, they'd knock the occasional product down a peg, so to speak. And but I mean, even bloody What Hi-Fi used to do 3- and 4-star reviews, which I think they've banned now. I don't think they do 3-star reviews of products anymore. They just simply send the product back and say, we're not reviewing this or something. But I mean, back in the day, I'm sure there were genuinely,
They were definitely capable of doing that, and yes. It was a lottery. You may be right. It's not a lottery now, but it was definitely a lottery then. And you could almost say, well, the reviewer got out the wrong side of the bed that morning or something, because some of it wasn't really justified.
No, they just. I guess if you were you could be unfortunately on the receiving end of a bit of spice, just for the sake of, like I say, it's a part of their business model was to appear to be more open and honest than maybe other magazines or something. But back to the difficulties. So you've gone from working for yourself to this corporatised world, and frankly, you're not really enjoying it. But your 3 years is up, and was it time to go at that point?
It happened earlier than that. After the second year, Christopher Short was having some difficulties with the board of directors for his own position. And he and I had, how should we say, a turbulent time together.
Yes.
I'm used to running my own business, and so was he. And I think he just found my approach to doing things was not as he would have liked it to have been. So, it would be like saying if you had a great idea, you try to exploit it. But in his view, if it didn't fit into the budget, you didn't exploit it till the next year, it was too prescriptive, my approach to doing things. And we did sort of rough each other up, or rub each other up the wrong way a little bit. And it certainly happened at hi-fi shows, if I was ever at one with him. And in those days, we would go to CES in Chicago, the summer CES in Chicago.
Yes.
He would almost insist that all of his staff and those distributors he was keeping a friendly eye on be in bed by 9 o'clock. And
that's not why you go to hi-fi shows, though.
he obviously didn't. He didn't get the script. He didn't get the script that we did anyway. So.
Okay, yeah. So not going to get on with him. Um, yeah. Okay. So you made it to the 2 year mark, and it was time for a change. Obviously.
Well, they felt that I had a contract for 3 years, but they terminated it early.
Okay.
And they did so first by getting rid of Christopher Short.
Mm-hmm.
So he disappeared, and he was replaced by his second in command, who was the accounts director, Jackie Stevens, who
Mm-hmm.
I got on very well with. Everything was running very smoothly, more smoothly than I could have ever imagined, until the board of directors appointed a new person to run both Tannoy and Mordaunt Short and its subsidiaries being Creek and Epos.
Okay.
And that person's remit was to come in and make savings or do things that he'd been told to do. Now, I get on with him well, but I didn't understand his approach to coming in on the first day at Mordaunt Short and asking to see me at 9 o'clock and me being out of the door at 15:15.
Oh.
Without even a chance to clear my desk. So,
Oh.
it was that prompt.
Yeah.
And,
Okay. Well, that probably isn't a very happy day in your memory, because that I've never been asked to do that, but I certainly know a few people that have, and it's slightly traumatizing, really, when you go to work not expecting that. So how did you take it positively, or like you seek out the positive in it, the fact that you got a fresh start, or you had the shits?
I was somewhat shocked, because I hadn't worked for anyone for many years, and that person only being my father. And he might have done that, but then he might have changed his mind afterwards. I had no opportunity to talk to this person again, or not for a while. After a while I did, but I have to say that at that particular point in time, I just thought, you're in breach of contract, and I'm going to make sure you know about it. So I contacted my lawyer, who was a particularly good one, and he was about to sort of unleash the hounds of hell, or dog, whatever expression we could use to ensure that my contract was honoured. And they did actually say, "Oh, sorry, we might have overstepped the mark. How about this? We employ you for 6 months as a freelance person, and you are required to write a story or the history of Creek Audio in 6 equal parts for us and our marketing team, who is at a different branch of the company. Another office in the country, which I did, and I reported to the marketing office, never to the factory.
Yes.
I had no idea what they were doing, and they never asked me for any advice after that. And it suited me, not because I was prepared to accept being paid 6 months' money for what is essentially 5 days' work, but the fact is, I mean, that does happen a lot. But the fact was, I wasn't really happy working there, and I didn't really find out until just before that my relationship with my wife had broken down to the point where I wanted to divorce, and that divorce caused me to be homeless. And
this is not going well. I don't know why I'm chuckling,
I'd lost my job, I'd lost my home, lost my son, and I was living with my parents in a spare room, and travelling by car, which was my company car, which they let me keep for about a week, and then I had to deliver it back to them.
Right.
And then I was really somewhat stuck. However,
very stuck. Wow.
I would say that I had an idea that I wanted to exploit, which was to continue in the field that I was in by some means or other. And I was working with one or two other people in the industry who'd also separated from the company they'd worked for and had ideas as well of a similar nature. So I did start another brand, but I was also forced by the nature of the bi-directional contract that I had to not compete with Creek Audio,
of course,
for the first 6 months after I left them. So, but that just gave me the time
set up
and run
to get it
business.
going.
So I did that. It was a company called EMF Audio, or Electromotive Force.
Indeed.
And initially, I wasn't going to make an amplifier. I did subsequently because of problems in achieving the result that I wanted. But the product I wanted to make was a mains regenerative power supply, something a company like PS Audio makes nowadays. I wanted to produce a mains powered but completely isolated or off the grid source of clean power for running audio equipment from.
Wow, so you were a bit of a pioneer then, really. I mean, I don't think anyone was really thinking of doing that because this stage we're talking late 80s or something, are we? Or what year?
It was 88, 89, something like that.
Yep. Wow. Okay. And on that note, I'll stop recording. We'll say goodbye to all the listeners, and I will convince you while you're still here to give me part 2 of this sometime in the near future, because I still have a pile of questions here that I want to ask, and if that's okay with you. So
perfectly. Yeah.
I really want to thank Mike Creek for coming on the show today and telling us probably more than we all bargained for, but it's all been very interesting, and we will be back with more with Mike soon, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Mike.